2018 as we do another obligation. Gerry Malone is a former member of the UK Parliament, having served from 1983 until 1987, then again from 1992 to 97. Malone was the Scottish editor of the Sunday Times from 1987 until 1990, and a broadcaster on BBC Radio Scotland and Radio Clyde from 1987 to 1992. He serves on the boards of several U.S. mutual funds, as well as on the boards of Bionic Labs and Medality Medical. Mr. Malone has a passion for opera and is an opera critic for Reaction Life, which is an online news, commentary, and arts publication. If you'd like to check out more about Mr. Malone, you can do so on his website, brexrisk.com. That's BREXRISK.com. Thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate it.
Well, of course, what that introduction tells you quite clearly is that I haven't held down a job since about 1983, since I got elected as the Member of Parliament for Aberdeen South. And what that misses out is that I am, fatally for any politician, by profession a lawyer, which sees you through most things, I have to say, but I haven't practiced law in earnest since 1983, so that is my excuse. It's a great pleasure to be with you this evening. I'm amazed that you all braved this December weather to come out and listen to what is happening in Britain, which I would hope to fill you in with a little. Talking round the, some of you as you came in round the drinks, I was delighted to know that there was a lot of interest in what was happening there. Last week's decisive election, however, has deprived me of a line that I used to really enjoy using every time I came to the United States. I would stand up and I would say to the audience, it's great to be here from London and arrive in a country of political normality compared to my own. Well, that line is now gone, because last week we got back to a life of relative political normality, where we have a government which has a majority of 80, where we have a Queen's speech which will happen later this week, which can now be implemented, where we know where we're going to go on the Brexit debate in terms of endorsing the deal that Boris Johnson got from the European Union. So what is not going to happen is that we are not going to crash out. We are going to leave on agreed terms on an interim basis and renegotiate our future with the EU. So let me touch on that first of all, the Brexit position and where we go from here. I'll then go on, if I may, to talk a little bit about the election, because I think it was a fascinating election. And I will also, because of always popular demand, nearly everybody that I spoke to asked me about Scottish independence. So I'm going to say a word or two about that, and I'll just give you a bit of a spoiler here, and why I really hate the idea, and why I think if it did happen it would be a disaster for Scotland, my own country, but never mind, that's the spoiler alert. So, Brexit. There's a very simple fact that a lot of people seem to forget when they say, can we redo this? Can we have another referendum? Can we go back? Can we turn the clock back? And the answer is no. The vase of our relationship with the European Union was broken when in 2016 we had a referendum which, by a narrowish margin, but I think in this country you understand narrow margins as well as we do in the United Kingdom when it comes to voting. By a narrow margin, a clear decision was taken that we would leave. And what I think would have been absolutely fatal, and what was getting at the British people, was the failure then of the Parliament that we've just said goodbye to, not to be able to get to an agreement on how we would do this. You would get a deal on one side of it. One group would jump up and say, we want that, the other would say no. You would then get to a position of a deal where a trade situation was sorted out, except for a problem across the Irish Sea. The DUP in Northern Ireland would jump up and say, well, we can't have that. And the reason was that none of these people really wanted this to happen. They all voted by a huge majority in Parliament to implement the leaving of the EU, but nobody would agree on the essential framework for stopping us collapsing out of the EU without a deal. And when the deal was put to Parliament, Parliament kept saying no in one form or another. It was squirming. And of course, in Europe, we became something of a laughingstock. And I kind of liken it to, you know, these guys who, somebody will come to a party and they're all right for the first bit, as we were at the European party for a while, and then we began to complain a bit, and then we complained more loudly, and then we wouldn't join in one of the games, we wouldn't join in the Euro game, and then we wouldn't join in the Schengen free movement game, and we really became a bit of a pain at this party. And then we decided to leave, and everybody sighed a great sigh of relief. But the problem was we went out the back front door and then came right back in through the back door. And there we still were, an awkward squad within Europe, which was bad for Britain, and I also say bad for our friends and partners in the European Union, because both Britain and the EU now needs to move on. And what I want to illustrate is how I think that will happen. It's quite easy to say that there's going to be an enormous fracture and economic disruption, but I think the truth will be somewhat different. We are in a period where we will continue to trade on the same terms that we have with Europe until a new deal is sorted out. We have accepted that regulation will remain as it was before Brexit happens at the end of January. And so we will continue to move in parallel. But what we will not do is take part in any of the political integration that is going to continue to take place within the European institutions. And we are not going to take part in any moves towards having an EU defence policy, detracting from NATO. We are not going to take part in any exercise that will take us further down the road of complete free movement of peoples from the rest of Europe who are not members of the EU into Europe. We will not do that, and gradually we will move apart, but I think on pretty amicable terms. And my reason for saying that is a lot of what we're talking about in terms of regulation, where people feared there would be disruption, and there was talk in the UK, well, you know, the day that we fall out, you won't be able to get drugs because they can't be imported, they can't be moved around, aeroplanes won't fly, all of that was scaremongering from people who simply didn't want this to happen, and certainly not to be a success. And these regulations are maybe important for the EU, but they're also global. So anybody who wants to sell drugs across the world has to comply with certain rules and regulations. Anybody who wants to fly in an aeroplane has to do the same. And these things will remain very firmly in place, and I don't think there will be the severe disruption, whatever happens. There wouldn't have been, but there certainly won't be now that we're going to negotiate. I'd also like to shoot a canard that's flying around about the fact that, well, this was all an accident, you know. If there had been another referendum, then it would all have been fine, we'd have put it right. And I think that's a really arrogant argument from people who are not prepared to accept a democratic result. And let me give you some idea of the extent of that democratic result. Because although the vote was close, 75% of the electorate in Britain voted in that referendum back in 2016. It is the biggest turnout of the British electorate in modern history. So the idea that somehow this was done in a dark corner, in a closet somewhere, is just simple, absolute nonsense. It was not. It was the biggest democratic exercise that Britain had seen. 17 million people voted to leave, 16.5 million voted to remain. So that's one thing. The second thing is that I've heard it often said in America when I'm speaking, the first thing that people say is, well, it's all about immigration, isn't it? Well, it wasn't. It was more fundamental. It was about basically accountable democracy. And when I'm speaking again in America, I find a shock when I point out that the European Commission, with whom we've had all these complex and difficult discussions, not a single one of them was elected. The President of the European Commission is appointed. And all of these great institutions that are meant to be moving Europe forward, none of them are properly accountable. Of course, advocates for all this say, well, you have the European Parliament. The European Parliament, full of MEPs from every European country as a member state, has only one sanction, and that is to dismiss the whole of the Council and the Commission of the EU in one go, which it exercised once because of corruption, but that's the only time it's ever done it. So it has no ability to mitigate an ongoing political process. And there was a huge amount of frustration, I think, in Britain about that. Take also into account that we weren't really full members of this club. We were country members. We didn't join the euro. We didn't join the Schengen Free Movement Agreement. We've always been sitting on the periphery, sniping away, saying we want to reform and we want to change. We want to hold back the integration process that Merkel and Macron now want to drive forward. We were in fact simply a damn nuisance. And I think that the EU will quickly resolve the situation that it had with us and move on to do what is their own agenda. It's up to them. I'm not going to say whether it's right or wrong, but it's not one that I think Britain would want to participate in. So that is where things will go. You will now see two things happen. Boris Johnson will bring to the Commons this week the bill to enable the deal that he set out with Europe before the election, the Get Brexit Done bill. And it will take away from British politics a running sore that has prevented us from looking at all sorts of other very important domestic, political and economic issues within the UK. We will get that. Not only that, it's my understanding, and I think this will be announced tomorrow or the next day, that he is going to say that he will pass into law an Act of Parliament saying that the trade negotiations from Britain's point of view have to be completed within a 12-month period. My own view is that the detail won't be hammered out, but a framework will be put in place within 12 months that allows the country then to move on. What is that going to be? Well, you know, my Brexit website, I give some consultative advice to mutual fund directors about what they should be holding their managers to account on in terms of keeping up to date with Brexit. And I've had to say in the course of the past 3 years, read the newspapers because your guess is as good as mine. It gets no better or more detailed than that. But what I'm saying to you is that now watch, if you're interested in this matter, how these trade negotiations unfold over time. I think you'll find that we get down very quickly to substantive action, and I think that's very much to be welcomed. Now to the election. It was extraordinary. And you will have gathered that I've stood in many elections, most of them actually unsuccessfully, which is quite a good thing from a politician's point of view, because you begin to appreciate that when you do get a successful election, it's a great thing to get into Parliament. I had a great 9 years in Parliament, 7 of them as a government minister, 2 as a government whip, and 5 as Minister for Health. And when I was kicked out in 1997, when the Blair Revolution came along and swept so many of us away, I lost my seat in Winchester by 2 votes. 2 votes. Now, the great thing about that was that for a short period, I was in the Guinness Book of Records as being the Member of Parliament who'd lost his seat by the fewest number of votes in the closest election. So after 6 recounts, I was thrown in the scrap heap and gone. So here we have an election which the thing I think I realised about this election was the Tory party was going to have to do something that it hasn't done for a long time. It was going to have to break into new territory, traditional Labour-held territory. And when I got my laptop out on the morning of the election, about 3 AM in the morning here, and was watching the results, the first thing that happened was a whole swathe of seats in the north of England that had been red, some of them, since 1908, were beginning to turn blue. And Boris Johnson had managed to get his message across into this area of the UK into which the Tories had never reached before. And that was the basis of his majority. What did not happen was that the Liberal Democrats didn't take Tory seats in the south, So basically the ground that the Tories had, which gave them their strength in the government, remained solid, whereas they breached what was called the Red Wall of politics, north of Watford Gap. I know some of you have either lived in London or probably even got a train to Watford once or twice, so you'll know where that is. North of that was not Tory territory, but it was in the referendum Leave territory by a big margin. Britain in the country voted to leave. In the metropolitan areas, it voted to remain. And that split has been translated through, and Boris Johnson's undertaking to make his top priority to get Brexit done resonated. So all of these seats fell to the Conservative Party. Now, what I think is quite interesting is the Prime Minister's reaction to this, which was less triumphalist than you might think Boris or Bojo or whatever you like to call him, who's very rumbustious and all of that. His reaction was, on the Friday morning, he got on a train and he went up north to go and talk to all the people in these constituencies who voted for the first time for the Conservative Party, because he understands one thing. And remember this lesson from this evening: we have not got these votes forever. My belief is that those votes that came from the Labour Party in the constituencies in the north of England have been lent to the Conservative Party on trust for a period. And if we do not, as a party and a government, fulfill that trust, if we fail, then they'll go back again, and they will go back to the Labour Party in short order. That is, if there is still a Labour Party to vote for in any meaningful way, and that depends on what they do now. And it's true, really, I suppose, of all political parties of opposition, that one of the most important things that you must do in a democracy, if you are to hope that there is a chance of an alternative being elected, is to shape yourself as the opposition in a form which is likely to gain support and have a chance at the polls. And I would like to say a little bit about the leader of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, who is probably not a household name. He's probably more of a household name in Lebanon than he certainly is in Lebanon, Pennsylvania, and for a number of reasons. And you'll have heard that he's left-wing, that he's always been a left-winger, but he's a nice old chap. He's been called grandpa by the press, and you know, we're always very good in Britain at cuddling extremely dangerous left-wing politicians and thinking, well, they're really all right, they mean okay at the end of the day. We, after all, were the country that called Stalin Uncle Joe. Never forget that. And so Grandpa Jeremy got into Parliament on the same day that I did in 1983. And I remember going down to the House of Commons, and if you're a new member of Parliament, the people that you can't see, the way, you know, we face each other, the Tories sit here, Labour sit there, and you've got the Mace in the middle and all of that. So the people that you can't see are your own colleagues, because you're looking that way out over the Labour benches, and I'm looking at you just now. And I'm very sorry to tell you that Jeremy Corbyn was sitting where you are sitting right now, I have to say. And you look a far more fashionable and up-to-date and relevant figure than Corbyn did in 1983 when he came to the House of Commons. It was unbelievable. We thought we'd seen Trotskyite students from 1968 being elected. There were two of them who sat there, Corbyn and a guy called Dave Nellis. And they were unreconstructed Marxists and unapologetic for it. I have no particular objection to somebody who has left-wing views becoming leader of their party. But I do object if that person has also tolerated, as Corbyn did, virulent anti-Semitism within the Labour Party. And I don't know how much of that story got across here. But it's the first time in my memory of politics, and as far as I can see in any living memory, that the chief rabbi has actually spoken up, supported by the Archbishop of Canterbury, criticising the leader of any party, an opposition party, for failing to take measures to stamp out anti-Semitism in their party. And that was a stain that ran right through this campaign, and I think forced a lot of people to understand that this man should not be our Prime Minister. he has harboured terrorists. I was next door to the Brighton bomb in 1984, staying at a different hotel. I remember it well. Some of my friends and colleagues were killed. Prime Minister was nearly killed. 2 weeks later, Jeremy Corbyn brought into the House of Commons for a meeting 2 of the accused perpetrators of that act, and he gave them succour. He has supported every mad left-wing regime that you can think of. He speaks out on Venezuela. He is, I'm not terribly sure about North Korea. Maybe that's the one he's missed out on. But all the others, he has been very much of that terrorist supporting nature. And the idea that somebody of that sort could actually hold the role of leader of Her Majesty's loyal opposition was bizarre. But the idea further that he might well actually one day end up as Prime Minister was to my mind unthinkable. But it could have happened. These things can happen. And you can see countries that look relatively stable do things which don't seem to be in their nature and which can be extreme and result in things in elections that become irreversible. And we avoided that. And my hope now is that the Labour Party will wake up, decide that it wants to be electable, decide that it needs to adopt a series of policies and a leader who is acceptable and can challenge a Conservative government. Even though I support Boris Johnson and the Conservative Party, bad governments are governments that are not properly opposed. And I remember when I was in Parliament and Minister for Health, almost the people that I spent most time talking to were the people on the other side about their healthcare policy and all of that, because there was always something to learn. And the chat across the aisles of politics is something that I found exceptionally important, and I'm afraid to say I think is lacking in many parts of the world today. It does not do well for the common weal. And why is that important? Well, I'm a Scot, as you know. And in Scotland we had in the 18th century something called the Enlightenment, David Hume, Adam Smith, all of these things, where Scotland's intellectual capital was exported across the world in a way that was far more extensive than one would have thought for a country then of about 2 million people. And one of the things that they had, one of their tenets, was the common good. And the common good is an exceptionally important philosophical principle that you can't actually define in any sense. You can't write it down in a piece of constitutional paper, what is the common good. But we really all know in our hearts what it is. And it's what happens often in small towns, it happens in communities where people are concerned for each other, and where the main thing is to make progress, where you can agree in things, where you can uplift people either in their incomes, in their standards, in their healthcare, whatever. That is the common good. And I fear that we have in politics nowadays lost sight of that basic philosophy that came from the Scottish Enlightenment, and we need to be reminded about it more. Which takes me neatly on to Scotland, which I know, having talked to some of you, you're interested in wondering when Scotland will become independent or whether there will be another referendum. I think there will be a long debate over the next 2 years about independence. We'll go back to the issue. In 2014, we had a referendum, and it was decisively rejected as an option for Scotland. And at that time, Alex Salmond, who was then the First Minister for Scotland, and the SNP leader, made a pledge which was agreed to by the current First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, that there would be no other referendum in this political generation, for the very simple reason that you can't keep taking the temperature of people over an issue as fundamental as independence every 2 or 3 years until you get the result that you want, and then say, well, that's the last one we're going to have and that's the end of it. Where do you stop? So there will be pressure for what is horribly known as Indie Ref 2, but Boris will not agree to that because he didn't need to have a coalition with the SNP. Jeremy Corbyn would have done that as the price of being in government. Boris Johnson will not. And so we will move on to elections across Scotland in 2021, where there will be a verdict on the SNP's hold on power over 10 or 11 years, where things have not gone well. Education is appalling. Scotland has fallen way down the register of international recognition in terms of education standards. Similarly in healthcare, healthcare outcomes in Scotland were better than the rest of the UK. They're now equal, if not getting worse. So their record in government hasn't been all that good, and I'm not going to predict what the outcome of that election in 2021 may be, but I think it will be more difficult for the SNP than they think. Because there's another illusion that needs to be shattered. You'll read headlines in all the papers because it's easy, and as I'm a former journalist for Sunday Times Scotland, I can tell you, reaching for an easy headline when you've got a deadline in front of you is the best thing that you do. Of course you do that. And of course it was electoral sweep. The Scottish political landscape has been changed. If I tell you that the SNP won a few more seats, not as many as they had in 2015, they won a few more, but they did that on an increased share of the vote of only 0.9%, you will understand that that is not a seismic shift in politics. Far from it. There was a slight shift that had a disproportionate effect on the number of seats they held, because under our first-past-the-post system, when you have a four-party system, where you have the Tories, the Lib Dems, Labour and the SNP, it is very easy for one small shift in support for one party to be magnified by a slippage in Labour's vote, for example, and for seats to change hands very rapidly. So, I would argue there has been no seismic shift. But it will be a debate. And would it be the right thing if Scotland became independent? Well, I thought I'd have a look and just try and put it in the context that would be simple to sort of get over here. Scotland has the same population as Minnesota, to within about a couple of 100,000. The GDP of Minnesota per head of population is 20% higher than the GDP per head of population in Scotland. So Scotland is not a hugely prosperous part of the United Kingdom. In addition to that, Scotland survives on a subvention from the UK Treasury of 18% of GDP, higher than any other part of the United Kingdom, apart from Northern Ireland, which is an exceptional case, as we all have to keep on saying. So for Scotland to become independent, it would find that this not very powerful GDP that it has already is immediately reduced by 18%. It is cut out from the rest of the UK. And of course the answer is, well, it will join Europe, it wanted to remain, that's all fine, the Europeans will love to have us, and that'll be the end of the matter. Well, no, it will not. Because Scotland will be kept at a great distance from the EU. Any new entrant to the EU has to qualify to join the euro. You're not allowed to use your own currency anymore, or that of any other country. And Scotland doesn't qualify to join the EU, because the euro, because to join the euro, you can't run a deficit of more than 3% of GDP, and Scotland runs a deficit just now, never mind getting rid of the 18% subvention, just now of 11%. And also, would it be a good idea to join Europe? Scotland's exports, 16% of them go to Europe, 64% of them go to England. So if you were arguing from a purely economic basis, the idea that you put a barrier up between your by far the biggest market that you've got and your own economy is ridiculous. And I hope that these facts, which are all just swept over, you know, people go and they see the film with Mel Gibson and William Wallace, they all shout freedom, they go back and they vote for independence and they don't bother about the economic argument. Well, I hope that this government will keep forcing that economic argument into the public domain and making it clear that it is not in the interest of anybody in the United Kingdom to split it up, and that we must keep our integrity. So that's really what I wanted to say to you this evening before we open it up for questions. I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to do this, because 3 weeks ago I felt sort of hopeless as a politician, that my country was directionless, it couldn't form any foreign policy, we were just neglecting things like defence, foreign affairs, all of those things. We weren't playing our part in the world as we should, we were obsessed with this Brexit issue. I now see a way in which we can get to the end of that process, build a new relationship, move on, make a positive contribution, and that, I'm pleased to say, gives me hope. Thank you very much. So, questions? Fire away. The floor is yours.
What's going to happen with Ireland, the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, and this business about a whole border or all that sort of thing?
No, absolutely. And I mean, there's been a lot of talk about the hard border. Should it be in the Irish Sea? Will it be in the middle of Ireland, the Northern Ireland, Ulster, all of that? Let me just put that in context. I think that a lot of that argument came from people on two polar ends of this debate about who wanted either to remain in Europe or did not. And they would find obstacles to anything to put in place here. Add to that the DUP looked on it as a very convenient stick to beat Sinn Féin with, who were on the opposite side of the argument. And they haven't been able to get on in the devolved assembly now for 3 years. It was a perverted argument that didn't reflect reality. The truth of the matter is that you can come to a customs arrangement whereby for substantive goods you pre-clear them on an electronic basis in exactly the same way that goods flow freely through Switzerland just now from all countries of Europe. Switzerland is not a part of the EU, and yet all that happens pretty well seamlessly because you put a system in place that can cope with it. And I just think that with goodwill, you would find that that problem can be gone round. And you know, Ireland, the Republic of Ireland's trade with we were far the biggest partner within the EU. I think it's something like 65–70% of Irish trade comes through, comes into Britain. So that will not be disrupted, and Britain will make a special arrangement if need be. And let me put that in historical context. Britain and Ireland have had this love-hate relationship ever since the 1920s and the Troubles and all of that, where no matter what has happened, when the Free State came into being in 1922, and then the Irish Republic as we know it now, later on, about 28, 29, I can't remember the exact time, Britain still, in spite of the conflict and the Troubles, gave Irish citizens free right of entry into the rest of the United Kingdom, which exists still until today. And not only that, but Irish citizens who come to Britain and set up residency immediately get a right to vote within the United Kingdom. And they did before the EU extended that right to them as well. So the only reason I mention that is to put in context the problem, where if you can get over the problem that was created with the Troubles and the animosity and all of that about 100 years ago, I think you can get over the free movement of goods with today's technology, border cross points, checking and whatever. And you know, the idea that there is some technical arrangement that could be described as a border where goods blip as they go from here to there, do you know, I don't care about that. That doesn't seem to me to be a fundamental constitutional issue. And people who want to make it so, I think, are determined to try to destroy the Anglo-Irish agreement and all the good work that was done by Britain, America, all of that to bring peace in the north. And I think that's a disgrace. That's what I think about that. Good answer.
Could you speak to trade relationships between the UK and the United States after a break from the EU?
Whoa, hang on a minute, I have to check my phone to see if there have been any tweets on that. I mean, look, I'm sure they will be great, but I think they will be long and hard to do. I don't think there will be any automatic favourite relationship, because Britain is going to have to continue with its relationship with Europe, and we're not going to break that and suddenly rush off and have a separate agreement with the USA. And I think it will be on an issue-by-issue basis. How can I put this bluntly? I don't think that sort of granular detail is what is the priority of the day in the White House just now. And so it will have to happen at different levels, and we'll move on once we've decided what our future relationship is with Europe. But the idea that we're going to be negotiating with Europe and having anything more than preliminary discussions with a whole host of other countries about opening up other trade opportunities is pie in the sky. The European arrangement is the one that must be put in place first, and anything else will be conditional upon that. And however, I will say this, that I actually think that Boris's election is going to be an extremely good thing for the administration here, because it gives a vehicle through which perhaps some more reasonable views may be taken towards the rest of Europe. I mean, I watched the NATO summit with a strange mixture of disbelief, almost reverent admiration for the way in which it was done, so unconventionally, straight out of the box, with realities being told in a way that diplomats never will, and yet chaos in its wake. You know, what all flows from that? I think that Boris being in number 10 and having the ear of the White House a little more than Theresa May ever had might well be a good thing in the step towards Europe, even though we're negotiating to come out. So, but for trade arrangements, nothing. I mean, you're not going to rush across and do something big within the next 6 months. The European negotiations come first, and they'll have to be some way down the road before there's more detailed engagement, in my view. I think that's a practical thing. So,
you mentioned the dysfunctional structure of the EU and how it contributed to the current issue. Looking forward, do you think that the EU can effectively survive without resetting the balance between the executive function, that small group that rules, and the European Parliament, given the fact that you've got over 400 million people in the EU today, and the number of states that are members today that are recent members far outnumber the original EU group? What is the role of the legislative body in the future of the EU?
wow, what a fundamental question that goes to the central point of all of this. There's no simple answer to that. It depends a lot on how the relationship evolves between Macron, whether he survives now. I mean, France is a country that's becoming ungovernable. And whoever succeeds Merkel, so you've got unknowns there about who's going to drive this process forward and whether they will make it more accountable. Because Europe has worked best when the Franco-German axis has been strong. Now the Franco-German axis is weak, so it's very difficult to do anything. Add to that the problem of economic stress, where the euro has been probably valued too low for the German economy, which has been great for them because they've exported to southern European countries who have taken on the debt that was required to take the exports. But they've also exported unemployment when that has happened. And you know, when you're talking about Spain, youth unemployment in Spain is still topping 35%, albeit it's getting better. That would be intolerable in this country. Whereas in Spain, they've just had to lump it because that's the price of being in the EU. So all these strains are out there, as you say, and quite how it will break, I don't know. There are populist movements arising in all of these countries. In Germany, there's a new party that has just got into the Bundestag, which is pretty frightening, actually, in terms of its right-wing stance, its fundamental stance, based on immigration, principally. And who knows what compromises the CDU will have to make with that to move forward. But in that context, actually changing the structure of the EU and getting a new balance, which would require a constitutional settlement to which everybody would agree, is maybe a bit pie in the sky. I took the view, I voted to remain. You may think from what I've been saying that I voted to leave. I didn't, I voted to remain. Largely from the point of view that I had always thought that it was better to be part of the argument. We're not part of the euro, so that doesn't matter. We're not part of Schengen, so that doesn't matter. But for the rest of it, driving Europe forward, I thought it was better that Britain's voice should be heard at the table all the time, and that on balance that was the right thing to do. There are a lot of countries who now are wondering whether that is true within Europe because they can't make the changes that you're talking about, of electing the Commission, electing the President, not having them being appointed, who are, I mean, frankly, a bunch of old has-beens who have failed in their nation-state politics and then pushed on to be commissioners. It was the graveyard for failed British politicians for a long time. It's true as well. You know, we've had a Prime Minister of Luxembourg who has not distinguished himself, in my view, who has just left office. But that's not, how are you going to drive a continent forward with people like that who are totally unelected? You do need to have reform, and maybe there'll be a growing appetite for it, and maybe it's the peripheral countries that you've referred to who have joined recently who will be the driving force for that, who won't tolerate it, and who will maybe point to Britain and say, if this does not change, then it may well be in the future there has to be another debate, and if Europe doesn't change either, it has to be a two-speed Europe, where we're sitting on one side in a free trade agreement, you guys are getting on building whatever it is you want, or we're gone. So it's impossible to say what will happen, but I think the tensions are there that will make some dynamic occur. Absolutely. Sir?
It took several decades for the Labour Party to go from Michael Foot to Tony Blair. Do you see any chance that Tony Blair type figure in the Labour Party could emerge?
Well, it didn't. It took a very short period of time to go from Michael Foot to Tony Blair.
Well, it was
well, no, but let's just remember how quickly politics can change, because that's an interesting perception that it took a long time. Michael Foot was gone after the 1983 elections, and we had John Smith, who was a Scottish Labour MP, who I knew very well. He was a Glasgow University graduate, same as I was. I debated with him at Glasgow and all of that, so I knew him well. He was from the moderate wing of the Labour Party, and he continued as leader until he died in the early 1990s. So we had then got Tony Blair. And so from the 83 election, it was 14 years, but another leader in between. And the Labour Party had transformed into a vehicle that was elected. I mean, you could argue, I mean, I would argue, if this was a party political occasion, I could give you plenty of reasons why it wasn't a great thing. But by and large, it governed from the centre on a pro-capitalist, interventionist agenda, etc., all of that. I mean, you know, I couldn't take exception to any of that in principle at all. And then they lost the plot, because what happened when Corbyn was elected was some bright spark decided it was a good idea to let this Marxist loose and give him a chance to be elected. So 22 Labour MPs who didn't even vote for him to be leader allowed him to put himself up to the country to be the leader of the party. And the way in which it works is the Parliamentary Labour Party controls who the candidates are. So Corbyn would never have been put up unless these bozos had decided, well, this is going to be a nice thing to do. We can't leave poor old Jeremy out. He's going to get nowhere anyway. So let's just put 22 of us will say, yeah, go on, Jeremy, that's all fine, off you go. What did Jeremy do? All his henchmen in the local parties decided that there would be a new policy that if you signed up for £3, you were allowed to vote in the Labour leadership election. And all his cohorts from militant tendency, this, that, and the next thing, all signed up in droves, and he ended up getting 60% of the popular vote in the country from the Labour Party members. That's how it happened. Quite how they will unwind all that, I don't know, but I think there is certainly a mood and an appetite from enough people in the Labour Party to want to be a credible opposition with a chance of government again, for that to unfold over the course of the coming years and watch this space. But it can happen far more quickly than decades. We can't afford that. I don't think Britain could afford to have no serious opposition for decades of a Tory government dominated by Boris. I think that would be pretty unlikely.
What changes do you think are in store for immigrants currently living in Britain?
Well, well, it depends where you're from. If you're an EU citizen living in Britain, you have continued right of residence. And I've forgotten the exact number. It's a pretty high number. I mean, I think it's 2 million. Visas were issued which have to be concluded by the end of January, and then you've got a permanent right of residence. I can say also from the point of view of Europe that I've got a holiday house in Portugal, and I have no problem being given access to that and a Portuguese residency to do all the things that I need to do. And I think that will all be done in extremely generous terms. And, you know, it gets to the heart of the matter. I really don't think that this, at the end of the day, while immigration was a theme, I don't think it was the driving force behind what happened. I think that's a perversion of the argument over more fundamental things doing it. We don't really have a massive immigration problem in the UK. I mean, we managed to, by and large, bring communities together and all of that and cope with it. And we will continue to have the same small L liberal policy, I hope, that we've always had. I wouldn't like to see that change. I mean, it's been a character of the British government for 200 years. Apart from the people that we're also a very good exporter of immigrants, as you will know. I mean, you just look right here, you can tell that.
Before the UK joined the EU, what was the promise or the aspiration that didn't pan out?
Well, no, but it did pan out. Let me tell you, I campaigned as a student. This was about 1974, we're talking about, when we joined the EU, and then Harold Wilson had the referendum to endorse the membership in 75, 76. I campaigned as a student to get into the EU because it was an escape from socialist Britain. You've got to remember that in 1970s, Britain was a place where the lights went out regularly, where you had 3-day weeks because of power strikes, where you had nationalised industries that did not respond to the demands of customers, where we were running huge deficits and the country was in decline. Rubbish was piling up in the streets, patients were not being treated in hospitals, as pickets stopped doctors getting in to do that. Trade unions were militant, our car industry was destroyed by the likes of a man called Red Rollo at British Leyland. This was a country from which you wanted to escape. And Britain, in my perception, was not doing it through its own disciplines internally. And joining the EU imposed disciplines on the country and the economy and spending levels and straitjackets and what you could and could not do that were a safety net to stop Britain becoming even more militantly left-wing than it was. So that's the context into which we went. We also went into something that everybody applauded, which was a free trade union. It was called it was not the European Union in those days, it was the EEC. And it was a free trade organisation which had a long way to go before there was actually free trade, and we worked on that until suddenly you got in the middle of the Thatcher years, there was a decision to have the euro. And we fortunately stood outside that. And that involved the surrendering of a huge number of big political decisions about your future and your economy. You couldn't decide your monetary policy. You couldn't decide your own fiscal policy. You were surrendering a whole range of things, either to European central bankers or to this unaccountable commission in Brussels, over which you had no long-term control. And that's why we began, that's where the fracture took place, if that's what you're really asking. It was that moment when the EEC went beyond being a free trading movement where you had free movement of people, free movement of goods. They haven't yet got around to services, incidentally. That's still not something that they've managed to implement. But all of that changed when this new political structure emerged and you had this word ever closer union, whatever that means. What that means is that officials will take over more and more control of the lives of people and be unaccountable. That's what it meant. And that's where I think the fracture came. That was the change.
Could you explain your optimism that a trade deal can get done by the end of the transition period? You said something.
I didn't say it would be complete. Yes, I will. I'll say a bit more about that. I think, I mean, the political determinant is to make progress and do it as quickly as possible. And I think he's got to show he means business, and by having a piece of legislation in place which says that he's bound to have a deal in place within 12 months, you will get this started. Nobody's going to be lazing around until March or April to do this. We have some problems, I think, not least because we just don't have the administrative capacity and trade negotiators within Whitehall to do this from a standing start. We'll have to pull them in from outside. Our trade arrangements have been negotiated by Europe for 40 years, and so that Whitehall element of ability has gone. We have to build that up. So there'll be a bit of a slow start, but we'll get down the road. And what I think will happen is that there will be some principles agreed, a broad framework, if you like, and it will be what you have to hang on the outside of that in terms of detail that might take a little bit longer. But, you know, it's a bold promise, but he has to, I think, say that he means business.
But in reality, if a framework's in place, but a technical deal's not in place by the end of next year, that's a WTO arrangement, right?
Maybe.
That's a,
Maybe. If he,
that's pretty,
if he
but
sticks-
in best of
if he
circumstances,
sticks-
12
if he-
months
if
to
he
do a
sticks-
trade
if he
agreement
sticks with
would be record pace.
yeah.
I just think
It's
12
tough.
months is
It's
gonna be
tough.
tough.
It's tough. No, I agree with that.
Unless he's willing to renege on that deadline, which
Well,
is
you
possible.
use an extreme word, but there's a lot more finesse in politics than renege. I think it will help him get down the road, which is a good thing. And similarly, we were meant to crash out of the EU. Christ knows how many times, and still we didn't, etc. And there'll always be something has to be said. The political dynamics will change. Who knows what will happen in Europe to make them want to make a change as well. They may want to do it fairly quickly. And it may well be that once the negotiations start, there's not that much different that we're going to do from what we're doing just now. That we'll be dislocating. It's really forward arrangements that we can't predict what we're going to do that will be the difficulty. But I agree with you. It's a stretch. It's a stretch. Not least because of the difficulty in actually having the skill sets to bring to bear to get into the detailed negotiations. It's not all getting off the plane and saying, "Yeah, it's done. He's my pal." I wonder who that is. Well, if you get on with King John, then you'll get on well with King John. That'll be fine. There'll be no problems. Sir?
If I understand correctly, the Scots are still basically were in favor of remaining and not of exiting.
Yeah, so is London.
Exactly. No, I realize not just the Scots, but that would, and it's a bit puzzling to me. I wonder how you account for that. Is it just because of a reflexive sense that the British want this and we want that? Or do you think that they were getting or are getting specific benefits that they fear they would lose?
I think there was a lot of psychology that if you don't want independence outright, the next best thing was to be part of the UK and Europe at the same time. And that sort of sharpened, that blunted the edge of just being part of the UK. So there was a bit of that. I think also, it is worth pointing out that there is a very strong Scottish cultural connection with Europe, particularly, dating back hundreds of years. Now, I'm not suggesting for a second that a man that you speak to in the Glasgow public house over a glass of beer will start weeping because Mary Queen of Scots was a Frenchwoman, really. But you get my point, that there is an instinctive feeling towards Europe. This was a good thing. And I suppose, well, I'm a Scot, and I wanted to remain because I thought it better to keep building a relationship that we've established for a long time and make it better rather than walk away. But how long that will stick in place, I don't know. And to your point, there were also other areas of the UK that were very, very high remain. But at the end of the day, it's the vote that counts, that's it.
As a former minister, how do you and your colleagues view President Trump's involvement on the world stage in the current political environment in the United States?
With a degree of mystery. And I'm not saying that lightly. My own view is that it's amazing that nothing worse has happened, actually. And when I say that, I look to what the view was about North Korea, for example, which at the outset of this presidency was likely to be the casus belli of World War III, because it would be badly handled. And then suddenly, by some means that is totally beyond normal conventional diplomacy, you suddenly find there's a relationship which is not going to escalate to that level just now. It's not solved by any manner of means. And there you go. I fear for the consistency of policy in the Middle East particularly, where I think great difficulty has been caused by movements of troops on a cavalier basis. The Syrian thing is the Kurds is the latest one, where decisions seem to be taken not on an informed view of history, and by history I'm loosely referring to the previous 3 weeks, not 30 or 40 years, and that causes instability and gives America something that I think is very damaging, which is not a reliable ally. I think that is the most damaging tag that can be tied to the United States in its foreign affairs with this, this rather incoherent form of policy made in the hoof. And it's genuinely difficult. We have to get through it one way or the other. You have to deal with it in your election in whatever way you choose to. And then we have to live with the consequences. But that's the challenge ahead. Any more?
Ask a second.
Yes, of course you can. Well, no, you ask the second one first. I don't like him. He asks difficult questions. Well, so do you, but I mean, I think I prefer yours.
I'm curious about your thoughts about Cameron's decision to have the referendum in the first place. About not only to have it, but the timing, given the negotiations he was doing with Brussels.
Well, he had it because of the coalition. And David Cameron did two things which I think are absolutely unforgivable. One of them was the referendum, because to be honest, I think that an issue of such complexity, and I'm not saying this from a patronising point of view, that the poor dears didn't know what we were doing when they voted for it. I mean, the arguments are out there. If you have a referendum, you have to accept the decision. But it is genuinely a reason that we have representative democracy, that we elect people who have time to reflect, take advice, to temper their views, all of that, and not go up to a ballot box and just take a yes or no answer to one of the most complex questions that has come to dominate our history in the last 40 years. It's not a yes or a no, but you have to frame the referendum that way. So it was the wrong thing to do. He did it to achieve a political compromise with people in his own party who would not have let him govern in coalition with the Liberal Democrats unless the referendum had been allowed and the voice of the people be heard. So that's the reasoning for all that. He also screwed it up because he thought it would be easy to win. And he looked at the Scottish referendum 2 years earlier, and he got away with winning that. I mean, he was really lucky. The curve of the graph of support for independence was on the increase during that referendum campaign, and he didn't. I mean, David Cameron's intervention nearly made Scotland independent, because if it had gone on another 2 weeks, he'd have driven everybody over the bloody line, which would have been a real shame. But he confused that with success. And so he decided that a referendum in Europe would be as easy, it would be a shoo-in. You'd wake up the next morning, that was the problem done, everybody in their box and move on. So that was a mistake. The other thing that was unforgivable was the fixed term Parliament Act. I mean, I don't know how many of you know, our Parliament never used to have a fixed term. They could run for a maximum of 5 years, but if a government was in trouble, then either the Prime Minister could call an election to reinforce his or her position, which is important if you're going to get business done, or the opposition could force you out of office and do all that. Now you require 75% of the House of Commons to have an election within 5 years. And we had the absurd position of Jeremy Corbyn not wanting to call a vote to have an election, where he said the government should go tomorrow, but I'm not going to have an election to force you out because I know I'm going to lose. And so these two things, I think, are unforgivable. Unforgivable. That would be a huge difference. John.
You've been talking this evening about Boris Johnson as if he were a normal politician, but in fact he isn't. He's very erratic, right? I mean, he's not necessarily the most thoughtful or consistent person. So why do you think that he's going to do any better than our president in terms of his future policies?
He's smart. His views are based on history and learning and understanding, and he adopts, I'm not saying this is a veneer and he's really at heart a completely stable creature, but he has a view of history that is rooted in a lot of thought, and so he's got that going for him to start with. The other thing I take issue with, at some point I would like you to go and find me a normal politician and introduce me to them, because I've never met one. What is a normal politician? I mean, the whole fact about politics, and I include myself in this, is there's some degree of abnormality in it, because you are immediately taking a decision that you know as a politician better than anybody else out there, and you will get elected. I mean, God, if you're even being elected to a town council, that's the same thing. You know better than your next door neighbour. You know, you're a select man. knows better than the person in the garden next door what's to be said about what goes on in the community. And that's just the nature of politics. So politicians aren't normal. He is unreliable in some ways. My greatest fear for him is that he's been unreliable. He was unreliable in the referendum campaign, where he suddenly went to the Leave camp side at the last moment, and I think that was opportunism. And I'm also conscious of the fact that the most important issue that is before Boris just now is Boris. That's it. He always puts himself first. I mean, he was the editor of the Spectator magazine for quite a while, and before that he was a commentator of the Telegraph. And he was an extremely good editor because he was flamboyant and great gestures, this, that, and the next thing. And so how that will translate and be tempered by office, we have to see. But I would not like to be unkind to your president here by saying he is anything like Boris. That would be totally unfair for somebody coming from a foreign country to tell him that. So I won't. He's not like that.
Feel free.
Okay, any more?
Thank you all very much for coming. Again, a gentle reminder that we have another presentation. We're not sure of the location. It's going to depend sort of what response is, but that is on January 14th. There are some flyers laying around. We do have a website, waclank.com, that you can go on. If you're not on the email list for these events, please go to that. And if you want to include other people, you know, the goal of this is to be fiercely nonpartisan and
Sorry.
on United States politics.
Okay. I'll do that.
And encourage conversation like you know we had tonight. I thank you so much for the questions you put forward. And thank you so much for taking the time. Gerry took a train from New York this afternoon. He's got to leave immediately tomorrow morning, so I really appreciate you making the effort to come out to.
Well, can I just say thank you for making it worthwhile for me. I've had a great time. Thank you.